For 1100 years, a city built on mud and wooden stakes became the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean. A place where refugees hiding from murderous barbarians somehow created something that would last longer than Rome itself. 117 rulers, countless wars, an empire of salt and silk and blood. This is the story of Venice, told through the people who lived it. Before we start, if you're here a lot, you know how this goes. A like, a subscribe, whatever you feel like. And I'm always curious where everyone's listening from. Drop your city and what time it is in the comments. Last week someone from Edinburgh said it was 3 in the morning and they were still awake. Which honestly, same energy. We're all just trying to make it through. So tonight we're heading back to ancient Italy. But hold on. Get yourself comfortable first. Adjust those pillows, pull up the blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. Trust me on this one. Picture this. It's the year 452, and you're running for your life. Not from soldiers, not from criminals, from something worse. You're running from Attila, the one they call the Scourge of God, the man whose horse, they say, leaves only dead grass where it walks. And right now, his army is tearing through northern Italy like a wildfire through dry wheat. You're a farmer, or you were. Your name is Aurelius. You had a small plot of land near a town called Aquileia, one of the bigger cities in Italy. Had, past tense. Because 3 days ago, Attila's Huns came over the hill, and your entire world ended in an afternoon. The screaming started around noon. You remember that. How strange that the worst moment of your life would happen under such a beautiful sky. Clear blue. Not a cloud. Like the heavens themselves didn't care what was about to happen. You grabbed your wife, your daughter, your son still young enough to carry, and you ran. Left everything. The house your grandfather built, the tools that had fed 3 generations, the little wooden chest where you kept your savings. Gone. All of it. Now you're standing at the edge of a lagoon, looking out at something you've never seen before. Islands. Dozens of them. Scattered across shallow water that shimmers green and brown in the afternoon light. Reeds everywhere. Birds circling overhead. The smell of salt and mud and something else. Something rotting. It's not exactly paradise. But here's the thing about the lagoon. Attila's cavalry can't reach it. His siege engines can't operate on water. His supply lines can't stretch across channels and marsh and mud. The place that looks like nothing, the place most people would walk right past, that's exactly where you need to be. You're not alone. There are others. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Families just like yours, all fleeing the same nightmare. Some came from Padua, some from Concordia, some from places that don't exist anymore because the Huns burned them to ash. Everyone has the same look on their face. That hollow expression of someone who's lost everything and hasn't quite processed it yet. An old fisherman waves you over. His name is Petrus. He's been living out here for years, on one of the larger islands called Torcello. Salt harvesting mostly. Some fishing. It's not much of a life, he says, but it's a life. He offers you space in his hut. Well, hut is generous. It's basically sticks and mud with a roof made of reeds. The floor is packed earth that turns to soup when it rains. There are mosquitoes. So many mosquitoes. They rise from the marshes at dusk like tiny vampires, and nothing you do keeps them away. The locals burn certain herbs that help a little, not enough, and the smell, that brackish, swampy odour that gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your dreams. It's not bad exactly, just alien. The scent of low tide mixed with rotting vegetation and fish, and something mineral, almost metallic. Salt, You'll later realize the smell of the lagoon is the smell of salt. The water itself is strange. Not quite seawater, not quite fresh. It changes colour depending on the light and the tide and the season. Green in the shallows where weeds grow, brown near the marshes, almost blue when the sun hits it right. You've never lived anywhere where water was so present, so constant, so inescapable, but you're alive, your family is alive, and right now, that's enough. Here's what nobody tells you about being a refugee. It's not just the running, it's what comes after. The long grinding process of turning nothing into something, the daily negotiation with survival. That first night your daughter asks when you're going home. She's 7, old enough to understand that something terrible happened, too young to understand that home doesn't exist anymore. You tell her soon. It's a lie, but sometimes lies are what get us through the night. Sleep doesn't come easy. The sounds are all wrong. Instead of crickets, you hear the slap of water against wooden posts. Instead of wind through olive trees, you hear the call of strange birds. Your wife cries quietly in the dark, and you pretend not to notice because you don't have any comfort to offer. Morning comes anyway. It always does. And that's when the real work begins. See, living in a lagoon isn't like living on solid ground. You can't just plant crops. The soil is too salty, too wet. You can't raise cattle because there's nowhere for them to graze. You can't do most of the things that humans had been doing for thousands of years. So you adapt. You have to. Petrus teaches you how to build a fish trap. It's simple, really. Wooden stakes driven into the muddy bottom, woven with reeds to create a maze. Fish swim in looking for food, can't find their way out. You check the traps at dawn and dusk. Some days you get enough to feed your family, some days you don't. The salt pans are more reliable. You learn to create shallow pools, where seawater evaporates, leaving behind crystals of pure white salt. It sounds simple, it's not. The whole process takes weeks, requires constant attention, and one good storm can destroy an entire season's work. You need to understand the weather, the tides, the wind. You need to know when to add more water and when to let it sit. You need patience, lots of patience. The Venetians would later call salt il vero fondamento del nostro Stato, the true foundation of our state. They weren't exaggerating. Everything Venice would become started here, in these salt pans, with refugees learning a new trade because they had no choice. But salt, it turns out, is valuable, really valuable. In a world without refrigeration, salt is the only thing that keeps meat from rotting. It's the only thing that preserves fish for the long winter months. Armies march on salted provisions. Ships sail with barrels of salted fish in their holds. People will pay good money for salt. Some people will even trade goods you desperately need. Within a year you've got a system going. Fish for food, salt for trade, reeds for building. It's not prosperity, but it's stability, which after what you've been through feels like a miracle. The lagoon changes you. That's something else nobody tells you. On land, you're fixed. Your farm is here. Your village is there. The road connects them, and that's your world. But in the lagoon, everything is different. Water is the road. Boats are your feet. The boundaries between here and there become fluid, literally. You learn to read the tides. High water means you can take larger boats through channels that would trap you at low tide. The timing of the moon matters in ways it never did before. You become attuned to rhythms you didn't even know existed. And slowly, without really noticing it happening. You stop thinking of yourself as a refugee waiting to go home. You start thinking of yourself as a lagoon dweller. This is home now. These islands, these channels, this strange watery world. Your son grows up not knowing any other life. He can navigate the channels better than you ever will. He knows which islands flood during the Aqua Alta, the high water that comes with autumn storms. He knows where the best fishing is, where the oyster beds hide, where the dangerous currents pull unwary boats into open sea. He's Venetian, even though that word doesn't really exist yet. The years pass. Attila dies in 453, choking on his own blood during his wedding night. The Huns disperse, but you don't go back. None of you do. Because here's the thing about the lagoon. Once it gets into your blood, it never really lets go. And besides, the mainland isn't safe. The Huns were just the beginning. After them came the Ostrogoths, then the Byzantine Romans trying to reclaim Italy, then the Lombards, another wave of Germanic warriors who carved up the peninsula like a roast pig. Each new invasion sent more refugees into the lagoon. Aquileia, that great city you once lived near, destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again until people just gave up. Many of those survivors ended up here, adding their skills, their labour, their hope to the growing community. By the time your grandchildren are born, there are real towns on the islands. Torcello has become a proper settlement with a church and everything. Heraclea rises on another cluster of islands, Malamocco on another. Each town has its own character, its own specialties, its own feuds with neighbouring islands. And somewhere in there, the question arises, who's in charge? This is where things get interesting. See, most of the time in human history, somebody powerful comes along and just takes over. A warlord with an army, a king claiming divine right, somebody with enough swords to make everyone else shut up and do what they're told. But the lagoon is different. Power here doesn't work the same way. You can't conquer islands if you don't have boats. You can't impose your will on fishermen who can just sail away to somewhere else. You can't tax people whose wealth comes from salt pans that can be abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere. So instead of conquest, there's negotiation. Instead of tyranny, there's consensus. Instead of a king, there's something new. In 726, the lagoon dwellers do something nobody expected. They hold an election. The various island communities come together and choose a leader. They call him the Dux, which is Latin for leader. In the Venetian dialect it becomes Doge. His name is Orso, and he's the first in a line that will last over 1,000 years. Think about that for a second. 1,000 years of elected leaders. Not kings passing power to their sons, not warlords seizing control through violence, elected officials chosen by the people, governing through laws and councils and the consent of the governed. It wasn't democracy in the modern sense. Only the wealthy could vote. Only the powerful really had a say. But compared to everywhere else in medieval Europe, it was revolutionary. A republic in an age of kings, a beacon of something that looked almost like freedom in a world of serfs and slaves, and it all started with refugees, desperate people fleeing violence, building something new in a place nobody else wanted. The irony is beautiful if you think about it. The greatest empires of the ancient world fell to barbarian invasions. Rome collapsed, the old order crumbled. But in the ruins, in the most unlikely place imaginable, something new was growing. Something that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean, produce some of the greatest art in human history, and show the world what a republic could achieve. All from a mudflat where people hid from Attila. Also, that first Doge probably had no idea what he was starting. He was just trying to keep the peace between squabbling island communities, settle disputes over fishing rights, make sure everyone contributed to defending the lagoon from pirates. He probably never imagined that 1100 years later there would still be a Doge living in a marble palace, ruling an empire that stretched from the Adriatic to Constantinople, that his successors would command the greatest fleet in the medieval world, that the city his refugees built would become so wealthy, so beautiful, so powerful that people would call it La Serenissima, the most serene republic. But that's how history works sometimes. The biggest things start with the smallest choices. A farmer deciding to flee to the lagoon, a fisherman offering shelter to strangers, a community choosing to work together instead of apart. Venice wasn't built in a day. It wasn't built in a century. It was built by generations of people making the same choice over and over again, to stay, to build, to adapt, to endure. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. Your great-great-grandchildren are Venetians now. They've never known any other life. The lagoon isn't a refuge anymore, it's home. The mud flats where Aurelius first landed have been built up, reinforced with wooden platforms covered with stone. There are proper houses now, proper churches, proper markets where goods from all over the Mediterranean change hands. This salt trade has made some families wealthy. The fishing trade has made others comfortable. And everywhere there's this sense of possibility, of being part of something new, something that's never existed before. Venice is becoming Venice. And this is just the beginning. The refugees have built something extraordinary in the most unlikely place imaginable. A city on water, a republic in an age of kings, a beacon of commerce and culture in a dark time. But building something is only half the battle. The other half is keeping it. And in the centuries to come, Venice will face challenges that make Attila look like a minor nuisance. Rival empires, deadly plagues, religious wars, economic collapse. It will survive them all. For over 1,000 years, it will survive them all. How? Well, that's a longer story. One that involves body snatchers, blind old men leading armies, explorers dictating adventures from prison cells, and a cat who went to war. But for now, as you settle deeper into your pillows, think about Aurelius, that terrified farmer running for his life, who somehow ended up building the foundation of an empire. Think about how the worst moments of our lives sometimes lead to the best things we could imagine. And think about the lagoon, that strange, watery world of mud and reeds and possibility. Still there, after all these centuries, still home to people who wouldn't live anywhere else. Venice sleeps tonight on its wooden stakes, surrounded by water, protected by its own improbability. And tomorrow, the story continues. Now, here's where things get weird. It's the year 828. Venice has been growing for almost 4 centuries. The lagoon refugees have become proper citizens of a proper city. There's money now, real money. Trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean, ships coming and going, a doge sitting in a palace that's actually made of stone instead of mud and sticks. But something's missing. See, in medieval Europe, cities needed saints, not just any saints, big ones, famous ones, the kind of saints that brought pilgrims from all over the Christian world, pilgrims who spent money on food and lodging and souvenirs, the kind of saints that gave a city prestige, that made other cities take you seriously. Venice didn't have one. Oh sure, there were local martyrs, minor holy people, the kind of saints that maybe got you a nice feast day and some prayers. but nothing major, nothing that could compete with Rome, which had Peter and Paul, nothing that could match Constantinople, which had basically everything else. Two Venetian merchants named Buono and Rustico were going to fix that. They were in Alexandria, Egypt, doing what Venetian merchants did, buying, selling, making connections. Alexandria was still a major trading hub back then, even though it had been under Muslim control for almost 2 centuries. Christians lived there, churches still operated, and in one of those churches in a modest tomb lay the body of St. Mark the Evangelist. Yes, that Mark. The guy who wrote one of the Gospels, the guy who supposedly founded the church in Alexandria way back in the 1st century. One of the most important figures in all of Christianity, just sitting there, in a city ruled by people who didn't really care about Christian relics. Buono looked at Rustico. Rustico looked at Buono. And somewhere in that look, a plan was born. They were going to steal a saint. Now, body snatching was actually pretty common in the Middle Ages. Relics were big business. Cities raided each other for bones and hair and fingernails of holy people. It was considered pious, sort of. You weren't really stealing, you were rescuing the saint from an unworthy location. At least that's how people justified it. The problem was getting past the guards, and the customs officials, and the Muslim authorities who would definitely not appreciate 2 foreigners making off with a famous Christian body. Here's what Buono and Rustico did. They bribed the local church custodians. Quietly, carefully, got access to the tomb, removed the body of St. Mark, and then they did something brilliant. They covered the body with pork, layers and layers of pig meat, packed around the saint like he was just another piece of cargo. And when the Muslim inspectors came to check what was in those barrels, they took one look at the unclean meat and waved the merchants through. Nobody wanted to dig through pork. Genius, right? The ship sailed. Storms hit. Because of course storms hit. The Mediterranean in spring is unpredictable, and this voyage was worse than most. Legend says the saint himself appeared to the captain during the worst of it, warning him about hidden rocks ahead. The captain changed course, the ship survived, and on a spring day in 828, St. Mark arrived in Venice. The city lost its mind. Church bells rang from every tower. People flooded the streets, pushing toward the harbour, desperate to see the holy cargo. Word had spread somehow, the way news always spreads in small communities, and by the time the ship docked, half of Venice was there. The Doge himself came down to the harbour, flanked by priests and nobles. Women wept, men crossed themselves, children climbed onto rooftops for a better view. After centuries of being a backwater collection of refugees, Venice finally had something that put it on the map. A genuine apostle, one of the writers of the Bible, their very own patron saint. They built him a church, a big one, the Basilica di San Marco, right in the heart of the city. Gold everywhere, mosaics covering every surface. The kind of church that made visitors stop and stare and realize that Venice was not playing around. The old church burned down in 976. They built an even better one. The basilica you can still visit today was finished in 1094. It's been standing there for almost 1,000 years, the winged lion of St. Mark flying from its facade. That lion would become the symbol of Venice. You'd see it on flags, on ships, on the gates of every territory Venice conquered, a reminder to everyone that this city had a saint behind it. This city was blessed, but saints don't pay the bills. Trade does. Let's talk about a guy named Giacomo. He's a merchant, 3rd-generation Venetian, and it's somewhere around 1100. His grandfather was one of those original refugees from the mainland. His father built boats. Giacomo trades spices. The spice trade is where the real money is. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from islands so far away that nobody in Europe even knows their real names. These aren't luxury items. Well, they are, but they're also necessities. Food in medieval Europe is bland as dirt without spices. Meat goes bad quickly. Spices preserve it. Spices hide the taste when it starts to turn. Rich people will pay absolutely stupid amounts of money for the stuff, and Venice controls the trade. Here's how it works. Goods from the Far East travel along the Silk Road or by ship across the Indian Ocean. They end up in Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital. Venetian merchants buy them there, load them onto Venetian ships, and sail them back to Venice. From Venice, the goods spread across Europe. Venice is the middleman. Venice takes a cut of everything. Giacomo's typical run looks like this. He loads his ship with Italian grain and wine. Good stuff that Constantinople wants. He sails east, maybe a month if the weather cooperates. The Adriatic can be tricky, sudden storms that come out of nowhere, but the real danger is rounding the Peloponnese, that hook of land at the bottom of Greece where the currents fight each other and the winds never blow the way you want them to. He's been doing this for 20 years. He knows every island, every safe harbour, every stretch of coast where pirates might be waiting. He knows which Byzantine officials need bribes and which ones don't. He knows which warehouses in Constantinople have the best pepper and which ones water down their merchandise. Once he reaches the great city, he sells the grain and wine, uses the money to buy pepper and silk and maybe some nice Byzantine cloth. The markets of Constantinople are like nothing back home. Merchants from everywhere, goods from the ends of the earth, languages he doesn't recognize, faces he's never seen. The smell of spices so strong it makes your eyes water. It's overwhelming and exhilarating and a little terrifying, even after all these years. Then he loads up and sails back, sells everything at a massive markup, pockets the difference. It's not easy work. Pirates are everywhere. Storms sink ships all the time. Political disputes can shut down trade routes overnight. Giacomo has lost friends to all of these. He's lost cargo. He nearly died himself twice. Once to a storm near Crete and once to Saracen raiders who his ship barely outran. But the money, my God, the money. His house isn't a shack anymore. It's a proper palazzo, brick and stone, right on the Grand Canal. He has servants. His wife wears Byzantine silk. His children will never know hunger, never know the desperate survival that his grandfather experienced in those early Lagoon days. Venice is getting rich, really rich, and with wealth comes power. The city needs ships, lots of them, merchant ships for trade, war galleys for protection. The demand is endless, and building ships the old way, one at a time in scattered boatyards, can't keep up. So Venice does something nobody else has thought of. They build a factory. The arsenal starts construction in 1104. It's a shipyard, but calling it a shipyard is like calling the ocean a puddle. This thing is massive. 45 acres of docks and workshops and warehouses, brick walls 2 miles long surrounding the whole complex, guards at every entrance, secrecy enforced with the threat of death. Nobody gets in without authorization. Nobody talks about what happens inside. Foreign powers would kill to know how Venice builds ships so fast. They've tried to steal workers, tried to bribe officials, tried to sneak spies through the gates. It never works. The arsenal keeps its secrets. Inside those walls, something revolutionary is happening. Picture a guy named Marco. He's a carpenter, one of the arsenaloti, the workers of the arsenale. His father was an Arsenalotto. His son will be an Arsenalotto. It's a lifetime job, practically hereditary, and it comes with privileges that regular workers can only dream of. Marco doesn't build entire ships. That's not how it works here. He builds frames, just the wooden frames that form the skeleton of a galley. All day, every day, the same shapes, the same cuts, the same joints. He's gotten so good at it that he could probably do it blindfolded. Down the canal from his workshop, another team builds hulls, another team makes oars, another team handles the masts. Each group specializes. Each group gets really, really good at their one thing. And when it's time to assemble a ship, all those parts come together like puzzle pieces. The ships themselves move through the arsenal on water. Canals run through the complex and the hulls float from station to station, picking up components as they go. It's an assembly line. Henry Ford wouldn't invent his version for another 800 years, but Venice figured it out in the 1100s. At peak production, the arsenal turns out a new galley every single day, fully equipped, ropes, sails, oars, weapons, everything, one ship per day. No other city in the world can match that. No other city comes close. The work is hard. Marco starts at dawn when the Marangona bell rings from the tower in St. Mark's Square. That's the carpenter's bell, and everyone in Venice can hear it. He works until the bell rings again at sunset. In between, he has one comfort: wine. The arsenal provides wine to all its workers. 6 times a day, guys come round with jugs, not small sips either. The workers consume something like 600,000 litres a year. That's about 2 litres per person per day, every day. It explains some of the accidents probably, but it also keeps the workers happy, keeps them loyal. The Arsenalotti are proud. They're the backbone of Venice, and they know it. Dante visits the arsenal around 1300. The poet, the guy who wrote about hell. He watches the workers boiling pitch in giant cauldrons, black tar bubbling and steaming used to waterproof the ships. In his Inferno, he describes one of the circles of hell as looking exactly like the arsenal's pitchworks. Bubbling, smoking, men labouring in the heat. Not exactly a compliment, but Dante was always kind of a downer. The arsenal makes Venice untouchable. No one else can produce warships so fast. No one else can replace losses so quickly. When Venice fights wars, it can rebuild its fleet faster than enemies can sink it. That's a strategic advantage money can't buy. And Venice fights wars. Oh, does Venice fight wars? Pirates are the first enemy. They infest the Adriatic coast, hiding in the inlets of Dalmatia, raiding Venetian merchant ships. Venice responds by conquering the entire coastline, one stronghold at a time, one island at a time. By the year 1000, the Doges are calling themselves Dukes of Dalmatia, and the pirates are mostly memories. But bigger threats are coming. The Byzantine Empire, Venice's main trading partner, is getting weaker. New powers are rising in the Mediterranean, and Venice, greedy Venice, is about to get an opportunity that will change everything. An army is gathering. Thousands of men from France and Germany and Italy, all wearing the cross of Christ. They call themselves Crusaders. They're heading east to fight Muslims and reclaim Jerusalem and save their souls through holy war. And they need ships. Giacomo the merchant is an old man by now. His son runs the business. His grandson is learning the trade. But Giacomo still remembers the old days, when Venice was just a collection of refugees hoping to survive. He's seen the city transform into something powerful, something wealthy, something that other nations respect and fear. He doesn't know it, but the biggest transformation is still coming. The Crusaders want ships. Venice has ships. And leading the negotiations is a man who might be the most cunning, most ruthless, most brilliant doge in Venetian history. A man who is 90 years old. A man who is completely blind. A man who will somehow manipulate an entire crusade into doing Venice's bidding, leading to the sack of the greatest Christian city in the world. His name is Enrico Dandolo, and his story is so insane that if you saw it in a movie, you'd say it was unrealistic. But that's for next time. For now, think about the Arsenale, those thousands of workers building ships that rule the seas. Think about Buono and Rustico, hiding a saint under pork and sailing home with Christianity's greatest heist. Think about the Lagoon refugees who somehow built an empire. Venice at the end of the 1100s is wealthy beyond imagination. Its ships sail everywhere. Its merchants deal in everything. Its patron saint watches from the basilica. That golden-winged lion promising protection and prosperity. The city has come so far from those mudflats where Aurelius first landed. It's become something unprecedented. A republic of merchants, a city of water, an empire in the making, and things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. The bell in St. Mark's Square falls silent as night settles over the lagoon. Ships rock gently at their moorings. Somewhere in the Arsenale, the last of the pitch fires burns down to embers. The city sleeps, dreaming of spices and silk and all the gold that tomorrow might bring. Venice sleeps, but history never does. Enrico Dandolo couldn't see you, but he could destroy you. By 1202, when this story really gets going, the man had been blind for decades. Nobody knows exactly how it happened. Some say the Byzantine emperor had him blinded during a diplomatic mission gone wrong, hot irons pressed to his eyes as punishment for being too clever. Others say it was an accident, a blow to the head that damaged something deep inside. Still others claim he could see a little, just not much, shapes and shadows in a world gone dim. Doesn't matter. What matters is that a man who couldn't see somehow saw more clearly than anyone else in the room. Always. He was also ancient, born around 1107, which made him somewhere north of 90 years old. In 1202, 90, in an age when most people died before 50, when a hard winter or a bad infection could take anyone, this guy just kept going, kept scheming, kept winning. The Venetians elected him Doge in 1192. He was 85. Most men that age are waiting to die. Dandolo was just getting started. So picture the scene. It's spring 1201. A delegation of French knights arrives in Venice. They're crusaders, or they want to be. Pope Innocent III has called for a new holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. Thousands of men across Europe have taken the cross, sworn to fight for Christ, ready to march east and win glory and salvation. But there's a problem. Jerusalem is far away. The overland route is brutal, months of marching through hostile territory. The smart play is to go by sea, land in Egypt, strike at the Muslim heartland, work your way to the holy city from there. For that you need ships. A lot of ships, enough to carry 30,000 men, plus horses, plus supplies, plus weapons. Nobody in Europe can provide that kind of fleet. Nobody except Venice. The French send 6 envoys to negotiate. They meet with Dandolo in the Doge's palace. Imagine that room. Marble floors, Byzantine mosaics glittering in the candlelight. The old blind man sitting in his chair, attendants around him, listening to the French make their pitch. We need ships. We need them soon. We'll pay whatever it costs. Dandolo listens, asks questions, takes his time. The French are impatient, eager, obviously desperate. They've committed to this crusade publicly. They can't back out now. They need those ships or they'll be humiliated in front of all Christendom. Dandolo knows all of this, and Dandolo always plays the long game. Here's the deal he offers. Venice will build the fleet, enough transports for 4,500 knights and their horses, 9,000 squires, 20,000 foot soldiers. Venice will also provide 50 war galleys as escort, armed and crewed at Venetian expense. In exchange, the Crusaders pay 85,000 silver marks. Plus Venice gets half of whatever territory the crusade conquers. It's an insane amount of money, more than the French can possibly afford. But they're committed now, trapped by their own enthusiasm, so they agree. They sign the contract. They go home to raise the funds. Venice gets to work. The arsenal shifts into high gear. Every shipyard in the city is commandeered for the project. Timber floods in from the mainland forests. Workers abandon their regular jobs. Blacksmiths forge anchors and chains around the clock. Rope makers twist cables until their hands bleed. For over a year, the entire Venetian economy revolves around building this fleet. The docks fill up with ships, hundreds of them. The largest fleet assembled in the Mediterranean since the days of the Roman Empire. All waiting, all ready, all very expensive, and then the Crusaders show up. And everything falls apart. See, the French envoys had promised 30,000 men. But when departure day arrives in the summer of 1202, only about 11,000 actually come. The rest took different routes, or changed their minds, or just never showed up. Turns out getting medieval knights to follow a schedule is basically impossible. 11,000 men can't pay for a fleet designed for 30,000. They're short. Really short. Even after they hand over everything they have, even after the leaders contribute their personal fortunes, they're still 34,000 marks in the hole. 34,000 marks. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the annual income of the King of England at the time. These guys showed up to a boat dealership, signed the papers for a yacht, and then realised they'd left their wallet in their other crusading pants. The crusade is stuck. The ships are ready. The men are ready. But nobody's going anywhere until Venice gets paid. This is where Dandolo makes his move. He's old. He's blind. He should be sitting by a fire somewhere, not dealing with this mess. But the man walks into that crowd of stranded crusaders, climbs onto a platform and gives the speech of his life. "I'm an old man," he tells them. "I'm weak. I need rest. But I see you here, pilgrims of Christ, and I cannot abandon you. If you'll have me, I'll take the cross myself. I'll come with you. I'll live or die alongside you in service to our Lord." The crowd goes insane. Here's this ancient blind doge offering to personally join the crusade. It's inspiring. It's moving. It completely distracts everyone from the financial problem. And then Dandolo lowers the boom. "Venice will forgive the debt," he says, temporarily, in exchange for one small favour. There's a city called Zadar down the Adriatic coast. Used to belong to Venice. Now it's controlled by the King of Hungary. On your way to Egypt, maybe you could stop by and take it back for us. The crusade leaders look at each other. Zadar is a Christian city. The King of Hungary is a Christian king who has himself taken crusading vows. Attacking Zadar would mean crusaders fighting crusaders. It would mean war against fellow believers. But what choice do they have? They're broke. They're stuck. And this old blind man has them exactly where he wants them. November 1202. The fleet arrives at Zadar. The citizens hang crosses from their walls, begging the crusaders to remember that they're all Christians here. It doesn't matter. The attack begins. 5 days later, Zadar falls. The Crusaders loot the city. The Pope excommunicates the entire expedition. Excommunicated Crusaders. Think about that for a second. These men left their homes to fight for Jesus. They took vows. They sewed crosses onto their clothes. They said goodbye to their families, possibly forever, because they believed that dying on crusade would wash away their sins and guarantee them a spot in heaven. And now they're officially damned. The Pope himself has declared that their souls are cut off from God. The very church they set out to serve has disowned them. They're going to hell, all of them, unless they can somehow make this right. How do you even process that? Hey guys, quick update. Remember how we were fighting for eternal salvation? Yeah, about that. Turns out attacking Christians was a bad idea. Who knew? And they're not done yet. Winter in Zadar. The Crusaders camp in the conquered city, waiting for spring, waiting to continue east. That's when a visitor arrives. A young Byzantine prince named Alexios, son of the recently deposed Emperor Isaac. He's got a proposition. Help me retake Constantinople from my uncle, he says. Put my father back on the throne. In exchange, I'll pay off everything you owe Venice. I'll provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for your crusade. I'll supply your army all the way to Jerusalem. I'll even submit the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope. It's a fantasy, the kind of promise only a desperate exile makes. There's no way any Byzantine emperor could deliver all that. The Orthodox Church would never submit to Rome. The treasury doesn't have that kind of money, but the Crusaders don't know that. And Dandolo does know, but Dandolo has his own agenda. See, Venetian merchants had been doing business in Constantinople for generations. Then, back in 1171, the Byzantine emperor had suddenly arrested every Venetian in the city. Thousands of people, seized their goods, threw them in prison. Some died, some were never heard from again. Dandolo had been there. He'd been part of a diplomatic mission trying to resolve the crisis. Some historians think that's when he lost his sight. Punishment from the emperor for being too aggressive in negotiations. Whether that's true or not, Dandolo hated the Byzantines. Hated them with the cold, patient hatred of a man who never forgets and never forgives. And now, 40 years later, an opportunity had fallen into his lap. Constantinople, the richest city in the world, the capital of an empire, and a crusader army that would do whatever he wanted because they couldn't afford to do anything else. The fleet sailed east. July 1203. The Crusaders attack Constantinople from the sea. It's a disaster for the Byzantines. The old blind Doge stands at the prow of his galley, the banner of St. Mark snapping in the wind, and personally leads the assault on the sea walls. 90 years old, blind, in full armour. First into the fight, the defenders break. The usurper emperor flees. Young Alexios and his father are restored to power. Everything is going according to plan. Except Alexios can't pay. The treasury is empty. The Orthodox clergy refuse to submit to Rome. The Byzantine people hate the Crusaders camped outside their walls. These barbarians who eat too much and drink too much and act like they own the place. Tensions rise. Riots break out. Someone sets a fire that burns a huge section of the city. In January 1204, a mob murders Alexios and his father. A new emperor takes power, one who tells the Crusaders to get lost. The Crusaders don't get lost. April 1204. The second assault on Constantinople. This time there's no pretense of helping anyone. This time it's conquest. 3 days. For 3 days, the greatest Christian city in the world is sacked by Christian soldiers. What happened in those 3 days is hard to describe. Palaces looted, churches stripped of everything valuable, monasteries ransacked, Libraries burned, artwork destroyed or stolen. The soldiers went house to house. They took everything: gold, silver, silk, jewels. They took things that had been in families for generations. They took things that had been in Constantinople since the time of the first emperors. They melted down bronze statues for the metal. They smashed mosaics for the gems. They stripped the lead from church roofs. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christianity, was turned into a barracks. Soldiers drank communion wine from sacred vessels. They brought pack mules inside to carry away the loot. They ripped the silver covering from the altar and hacked it into pieces small enough to carry. And the people. The Byzantine chroniclers wrote about what happened to the people. Murders in the streets, assaults in churches, holy places turned into scenes from a nightmare, nuns dragged from convents, priests killed at their altars. The city's population, the survivors anyway, fled with whatever they could carry. One chronicler wrote that even the Muslims, even the Saracens, would have been more merciful. He was probably right. The French and Flemish crusaders took whatever they could grab. They went crazy, smashing and burning, driven by greed and frustration and the adrenaline of victory. The Venetians were different. The Venetians kept their heads. They didn't destroy treasure, they inventoried it. They catalogued the loot with the same careful attention they brought to their merchant ledgers. This much gold, this many gems, this painting, that tapestry, those relics. They knew exactly what they were taking, and they took the best of everything. The bronze horses came to Venice, 4 of them, magnificent sculptures from a chariot group that had stood in the hippodrome for 800 years. The Venetians loaded them onto ships and sailed them home. They put them right on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. You can still see them there. Well, copies. The originals are inside now, protected from pollution. But for centuries those horses stood in the open air, a reminder of what Venice had done, what Venice had taken, what Venice was capable of. They took relics too, pieces of the true cross, the arm of St. George, the head of St. John the Baptist, or something somebody said was the head of St. John the Baptist. Medieval people collected this, stuff like sports memorabilia. Venice's churches filled up with holy objects looted from Constantinople. When the dust settled, the Crusaders divided up what was left of the Byzantine Empire. They created a new Latin Empire of Constantinople, ruled by a French count. But the real winner was Venice. Dandolo became Lord of 3/8 of the Roman Empire. That was his actual title. Venice got the best ports, the best islands, the best strategic locations: Crete, the Aegean Islands, colonies along the coast of Greece, Modone and Corone, which they called the eyes of the Republic because they watched over the sea lanes. The trade routes that had made Venice rich. Now Venice controlled both ends. No more paying tribute to Byzantine emperors, no more negotiating for access. The entire eastern Mediterranean was a Venetian lake. Dandolo died in Constantinople in 1205. He was buried in the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Christian world, which the Crusaders had turned into a Catholic cathedral. His tomb is still there, more or less. A marker anyway. The body is long gone, probably destroyed when the Ottomans took the city centuries later. But his legacy lived on. Venice entered the 13th century as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. The old blind man who couldn't see had somehow seen further than anyone else. He'd seen opportunity where others saw crisis. He'd seen empire where others saw debt. He'd manipulated princes and popes and knights and kings, turned a crusade meant for Jerusalem into a war for Venetian commerce. Brilliant? Absolutely. Evil? Probably. Effective? Without question. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land, never came close. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands. The Byzantine Empire, though it would stagger on for another 2 centuries, never recovered its old glory. And thousands of people died, not fighting for Christ, but fighting for Venetian profit. That's the thing about Venice. It was beautiful. It was civilized. It produced magnificent art and enlightened government, and a republic that lasted 1,000 years. But underneath all that beauty there was steel. Cold, calculating steel. Venice did what it needed to do. Venice took what it wanted to take, and Venice never, ever apologized. The horses of Constantinople still stand above St. Mark's Square, and if you look at them in the right light, you can almost see what they saw. An empire falling, a city burning, and an old blind man smiling in the smoke. The cell was cold. Genoese prisons weren't designed for comfort. Marco Polo sat in the dark, rubbing his wrists where the chains had been, listening to the rats scuttle along the walls. He was 44 years old. He'd seen things most Europeans couldn't imagine. He'd walked across deserts and mountains, dined with the most powerful ruler on earth, carried messages between kingdoms that didn't even appear on Venetian maps. And now he was stuck in this hole, waiting for someone to ransom him or forget him. It was 1298, September. Venice and Genoa had been at each other's throats for generations, and Marco had gotten himself captured in a naval battle off the island of Cazzola. Bad luck, really. His galley had been in the wrong place when the Genoese fleet swept through. Now here he was, a prisoner of war with nothing to do but remember. That's when he met Rustichello. Rustichello of Pisa was a writer, romance stories mostly, tales of King Arthur and his knights, the kind of thing people love to read aloud at fancy dinners. He'd been rotting in this same prison for years, captured in some earlier conflict nobody remembered anymore. The two men started talking. What else was there to do? And somewhere in those conversations, Rustichello realized that the quiet Venetian in the next cell had one hell of a story to tell. "You've been where?" Marco told him. 24 years of travel, 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, Emperor of the Mongols, ruler of China and half of Asia. He'd left Venice in 1271, just a teenager following his father and uncle on their second trip east. They travelled overland through Armenia, through Persia, across the roof of the world where the air got thin and fires burned strange. They crossed deserts so vast you could walk for weeks and never see a tree. They passed through cities whose names sounded like music, Samarkand and Kashgar and Khotan, and then, finally, China. Marco couldn't find the words at first. How do you describe a civilization that makes everything you know look primitive? Cities with 1 million people when Venice had maybe 100,000. Paved roads that ran straight for hundreds of miles. A postal system so efficient that messages crossed the empire in days. Paper money, which Europeans didn't use. Nobody in Venice would accept a piece of paper as payment for anything. But in China, paper notes backed by the Khan's authority bought whatever you wanted. He'd seen coal burned as fuel, black rocks from the ground that kept you warm all winter. Europeans didn't use coal. They burned wood like their ancestors had for thousands of years. But in China, people dug these strange stones out of the earth and set them on fire, and the fire lasted longer and burned hotter than any wood could manage. Marco tried to explain this to people back home. They thought he was making it up. He'd seen pasta made from wheat, noodles that went on forever. He'd seen fireworks exploding in the night sky. gunpowder used for celebration instead of war. Imagine trying to describe fireworks to someone who's never seen them. So there's this powder, and you light it on fire, and it shoots into the sky and explodes into colours. Sure, Marco, sure. He'd seen elephants and rhinoceroses and animals that sounded made up but weren't. He'd seen a communication system where messages could cross the entire empire in days, passed from rider to rider at stations, spread across thousands of miles. He'd seen roads that ran straight as arrows for distances that would take weeks to walk. And the money, paper money. In Venice, money was gold and silver, coins you could weigh, coins you could bite to test if they were real. But in China, the Khan just printed paper, stamped it with his seal and declared it valuable, and everyone accepted it. You could buy anything with these little pieces of paper because the Khan said you could. It was insane. It was brilliant. It wouldn't catch on in Europe for another 500 years. Kublai Khan had taken a liking to the young Venetian, used him as an envoy, sent him on missions to distant provinces. Marco learned to observe, to report, to notice the details that mattered. He became useful, and useful people lived well in the Khan service. Rustichello grabbed a pen. What came out of that prison cell changed the world. The book they wrote together, usually called The Travels of Marco Polo, became the most popular travel account in Europe. Hundreds of copies circulated. People couldn't get enough. They'd never heard of places like Cathay or Tipangu. They'd never imagined that there were civilizations out there richer and older, and more sophisticated than anything in Christendom. Some people thought Marco was lying. The book was too fantastic, too full of wonders. Where were the monsters and dog-headed men that travellers always reported? Why didn't Marco mention the Great Wall, or tea, or bound feet? Skeptics called him Marco Millions, mocking his claims about the wealth of the East. But Marco stuck to his story. On his deathbed decades later, friends begged him to admit he'd made it all up. Take back the lies, they said. Save your soul before you meet God. Marco refused. I haven't told half of what I saw, he said. Half. Here's the thing, though. While Marco Polo was sitting in that prison, dictating his memories of the Khan's pleasure gardens and the spice markets of Hormuz, his home city was fighting for its life. Venice and Genoa were locked in a war that would determine who controlled the Mediterranean. 2 cities, 2 trading empires, not enough room for both. The rivalry had been building for over a century. Venice controlled the eastern routes, the old Byzantine trade that led to Constantinople and beyond. Genoa pushed into the Black Sea, established colonies on the Crimean coast, tapped into the overland Silk Roads that Marco's family had travelled. Every few decades, the competition boiled over into open war. They fought in the Aegean, where both cities had islands and trading posts. They fought in the Black Sea, where Genoese and Venetian merchants undercut each other in the grain trade. They fought off the coast of Syria, where crusader cities played one side against the other. They fought in waters so far apart that news of battles took months to reach home. These weren't small skirmishes. These were fleet actions with hundreds of ships, thousands of men. The battle where Marco Polo got captured involved nearly 200 galleys. The sea churned with oars and blood and floating wreckage. Venice won some. Genoa won some. Nobody could land a knockout blow. Both cities were too rich, too stubborn, too convinced that retreat meant ruin. By the 1370s, the war had attracted outside players. Genoa allied with the Duke of Austria, who held lands along Venice's northern border. They brought in the King of Hungary, who wanted to expand down the Adriatic coast. They recruited Padua, Venice's nearest neighbour on the Italian mainland, a city that had plenty of reasons to hate its powerful lagoon rival. Venice scrambled for allies too. They found friends in Milan, in Cyprus, in the remnants of the Byzantine Empire that Dandelo's crusade had shattered. But when the crisis came, Venice was mostly alone. 1379, the Genoese fleet sailed up the Adriatic. Not a raid this time, an invasion. They had allies marching overland too. Hungarian cavalry sweeping down from the north. Paduan soldiers crossing the river boundaries. For the first time in memory, Venice faced attack from every direction at once. The Genoese hit Chioggia first, a fishing town at the southern end of the lagoon, 15 miles from Venice, close enough to see the campanile of St. Mark's on a clear day. The garrison fought hard, 2 weeks of resistance, but the town fell in August. Suddenly the enemy was inside the lagoon itself. Venice panicked. For the first time in centuries, the city faced an existential threat. Not pirates, not raiders, but a full army with siege equipment and enough ships to blockade the channels. If Chioggia held, if the Genoese could push deeper into the lagoon, Venice itself might fall. The streets filled with refugees. People packed their valuables. Some families made arrangements to flee to relatives on the mainland, anywhere but here. The price of bread doubled, then tripled. Rumours spread faster than plague. The Doge at the time was Andrea Contarini, 70 years old, just elected that year, thrown into command of a desperate defence. And this old man, he stepped up. He rallied the city. Every able-bodied man reported for duty. Nobles armed their households. Merchants contributed their wealth. Refugees from the mainland, peasants who'd fled the fighting, were given weapons and told to fight for the city that had sheltered them. Women melted down their jewellery to pay for mercenaries, condottieri they called them, professional soldiers who fought for whoever paid best. Churches handed over their gold. Even the prisoners in the city's jails were offered freedom in exchange for service. Side note on those condottieri: Italian warfare in the 1300s was basically run by mercenary captains who'd sell their armies to the highest bidder. Your enemies this month might be your employees next month. It was like the gig economy, but with swords. Venice usually hired them. Now Venice was desperate enough to arm prisoners, and the Arsenale, that engine of Venetian power, went into overdrive. Shifts ran through the night. Torches blazed until dawn. The hammering never stopped. They didn't have time to build new ships. The Genoese were already in the lagoon, so the Venetians did something clever. They took the ships they had, and they blocked the channels, sank hulks in the shallow water, drove piles into the mud, turned the geography that had always protected Venice into a trap. The Genoese in Chioggia had a fleet, but fleets need room to manoeuvre. Fleets need open water, and suddenly the Genoese fleet was stuck in a harbour that was shrinking by the day. Then winter came. Cold fog rolled across the lagoon. Supply ships trying to reach Chioggia got lost in the maze of channels. Some ran aground. Some were ambushed by Venetian galleys that knew these waters like they knew their own faces. Food started running out. Sickness spread through the Genoese camp. The Venetians could wait. They were home. They had the whole city behind them, every baker and fishmonger and shipwright working around the clock. The Genoese were guests who'd overstayed their welcome in a house that was slowly turning into a prison. By spring of 1380, the tables had turned completely. The Venetians attacked. They used something new this time, something most of their enemies had never seen on ships before. Gunpowder, cannons on galleys, heavy iron tubes that roared and smoked and threw stone balls across the water. The technology was crude. The aim was terrible. But the psychological effect was devastating. Imagine you're a Genoese sailor, already cold and hungry, watching a Venetian warship approach, and then there's a flash and a thunder like nothing you've ever heard, and the deck next to you splinters into 1,000 pieces. The Genoese broke. Their fleet trapped in Chioggia harbour couldn't escape. The Venetians captured ships, captured men, captured supplies. The invasion that had threatened to end Venice became a catastrophe for Genoa. The war wound down after that. Both sides were exhausted. The Peace of Turin in 1381 formally ended hostilities. Venice had to give up some claims, pay some reparations, accept some limits on her trade. On paper, it almost looked like a draw. But here's what happened next. Genoa, victorious in so many battles, rich and powerful and proud, tore itself apart. Factions within the city started fighting. Coups and counter-coups. Civil wars that lasted decades. By 1400, Genoa had been conquered by Milan, reconquered by France, and generally stopped being a serious threat to anyone. Venice, the city that had been 15 miles from destruction, recovered. Not just recovered, flourished. The arsenal kept building ships, the merchants kept sailing east, the gold kept flowing into the treasury. Within a generation, Venice was stronger than ever. Why? Part of it was luck, part of it was geography, but mostly it was the system. Venice had figured out something rare in medieval Europe. They'd built a government that was ruthless enough to win and stable enough to last. No civil wars, no coups, no factions tearing each other apart over who got to be king. The Republic had checks and balances, councils and committees, elections and terms of office. The Doge wasn't a king. He couldn't just decide things. Major policies required approval from the Senate, the Great Council, a bewildering array of boards and commissions. It took forever to get anything done. But once decisions were made, they stuck. The whole system was designed to prevent any one person from getting too powerful. The Doge himself, Venetians joked, was nothing more than a tavern sign, a decorative symbol of power. Below him sat councils and sub-councils, the Minor Council, the Quarantia, the Senate, the Savi, wise men who advised on military matters, maritime affairs, mainland territories, all of them watching each other, voting on each other's proposals, making sure nobody accumulated too much power. Imagine a corporate board meeting, but with more velvet and more daggers hidden under cloaks. And then there was the Council of 10. Originally created to investigate a conspiracy in 1310, they became the Republic's secret police. Spies everywhere. Opened mail. Listened to rumours. Anyone suspected of plotting against the state could disappear in the night. Think of them as the medieval Venetian FBI, except with fewer rules and more torture chambers. Pleasant people. Great at parties. Paranoid? Sure. But effective. Venice had fewer internal upheavals in 1,000 years than most Italian cities had in a single century. Outsiders were amazed. They called it the myth of Venice, the idea that this city had perfected government, balanced democracy and aristocracy into a system that actually worked. It wasn't perfect. The golden book that listed noble families meant power stayed locked up tight. Corruption existed. Some doges were brilliant, others were mediocrities. But compared to everywhere else, Venice worked. The system survived plagues, wars, crusades, economic crashes, and that moment in 1379 when enemy soldiers stood close enough to smell the fish markets. Marco Polo came home from his Genoese prison around 1300. The ransom got paid, the war wound down, And he walked back into a Venice that had nearly ceased to exist while he was gone. He never travelled again, settled down, got married, had 3 daughters, became just another merchant in a city full of merchants. He kept telling his stories, though, kept insisting they were true, and centuries later, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus carried a well-thumbed copy of Marco's book on his voyage west. Looking for a new route to all those wonders Marco had described, Cathay and Cipangu and the courts of the Khan. He didn't find them, of course. He found something else entirely. But that's another story. The point is this. While Marco Polo rotted in that prison cell while he dictated his memories to Rustichello, the city he loved almost died. And somehow, improbably, against all odds, it didn't. Venice survived. Venice always survived. The scars healed faster than anyone expected. Within a decade of the Peace of Turin, Venetian galleys were sailing east again, loading up with pepper and cinnamon, bringing back profits that made the war years seem like a bad dream. The treasury refilled. The arsenal kept building. New palaces rose along the Grand Canal. And something else was happening too. Something you could feel in the air. Artists were experimenting with new techniques. Scholars were digging up old Greek texts. Ideas were spreading. The whole world seemed to be waking up from a long sleep. They'd call it the Renaissance later. The rebirth. And Venice was about to become one of its greatest stages. The smell of pigment hit you before you even reached the door. Linseed oil, turpentine, ground minerals that cost more than most families earned in a year. If you were lucky enough to work in Titian's studio in the 1530s, that smell became part of you. It seeped into your clothes, your hair, your skin. Your mother would complain that you brought the workshop home every night. Tiziano Vecelli, Titian to the rest of the world, the greatest painter in Venice, which meant the greatest painter anywhere that mattered. Kings and emperors begged for his work. Popes sat for portraits. The man charged whatever he wanted and people paid it, because a Titian hanging in your palace told everyone exactly how important you were. His apprentices learned fast or got thrown out. Grind the pigments finer, stretch the canvas tighter, mix the colours exactly as the master demands, and watch. Always watch. Because Titian did things with paint that nobody had done before, layering colour on colour, building up flesh tones that seemed to glow from within. He'd start a painting, then set it aside for months, sometimes years. He'd turn the canvas to the wall and ignore it completely. Then one day he'd pull it out, stare at it for hours, and attack it again, adding, subtracting, smearing paint with his fingers when brushes weren't direct enough. The results were unlike anything else in Europe. His Venus of Urbino scandalized half of Italy and made the other half quietly commission similar works. His religious paintings hung in churches across the continent. His portrait of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, showed the most powerful man in the world as actually human, aging and tired beneath all that armour. Venice had painters everywhere you looked. The Bellini brothers, Giovanni and Gentile, had dominated the previous generation. Their workshop trained half the artists in the city. Vittore Carpaccio painted massive canvases showing Venetian life, processions and ceremonies, and the lagoon itself, documents of a city in love with its own image. And then there was Tintoretto, Jacopo Robusti, called Tintoretto because his father was a dyer, a tintore. He worked so fast people thought he was cutting corners. He wasn't. He was just that good. His Last Supper in San Giorgio Maggiore doesn't sit still. The whole scene swirls with angels and servants and smoke. light breaking through darkness, everything in motion. Tintoretto and Titian hated each other. Professional rivalry, personal grudges, the usual mess. Venice was big enough for both of them barely, but they never missed a chance to undercut each other's reputation. Artists haven't changed much. The thing is, all this art cost money. Massive amounts of money. Patrons who wanted chapels decorated and palaces filled, and their own faces immortalized on canvas. Venice had that money because Venice had trade, and Venice had trade because Venice had position. Stand on the Rialto Bridge, the one made of wood back then before they rebuilt it in stone. Look down at the Grand Canal. Count the boats, barges loaded with timber, galleys returning from Alexandria with holds full of pepper, small craft darting between the larger ships, carrying passengers who'd pay a few coins to get across faster than walking. The whole city floated on commerce. Everything moved by water because there were no streets. Not really, just canals and narrow footpaths and bridges that connected one small island to the next. Goods came in through the lagoon and spread out through 1,000 smaller channels. The system worked because everyone knew their role. The boatmen, the porters, the customs officials who checked every cargo and assessed every tax. Venetian merchants were not nice people. A German artist named Albrecht Dürer visited around 1506. He'd come to see the paintings and study the techniques, but he also had business to conduct, prints to sell, commissions to arrange. His letters home complained bitterly about the locals, the most treacherous, lying, thieving scoundrels he'd ever met. That's what he called them. People who smiled to your face while picking your pocket, who'd agree to a deal, then change the terms when you weren't looking, who'd sell their own mothers if the price was right. Dürer wasn't entirely wrong. Venice ran on negotiation, and negotiation in Venice was a blood sport. Everybody was working an angle. Everybody had something to sell and something to hide. Trust was for suckers. Contracts were for people who couldn't afford lawyers. Think of it like this. If medieval Venice had Yelp reviews, every merchant would have 1 star and a comment that said, "Tried to charge me double, would not recommend, also possibly cursed my family." But that same ruthlessness made Venice the best at everything. Competition drove quality. If your goods weren't better than the next merchant's, if your prices weren't sharper, if your delivery wasn't faster, you'd be out of business by next season. The survivors were the best in the world at what they did. Take glass, Murano glass. The furnaces had been moved to the island of Murano centuries earlier, partly to reduce fire risk in the main city, mostly to keep the secrets contained. Glassblowers weren't allowed to leave. Seriously, if you knew how to make Venetian glass and tried to emigrate, the state would hunt you down. Some said they'd kill you. Others said they'd just drag you back and make your life miserable until you wish they'd killed you. The glass was worth it. Nobody else could make stuff this good. Clear crystal that rang like bells. Colours so pure they seemed lit from inside. Mirrors that showed your reflection without distortion, when mirrors from anywhere else made you look like a funhouse version of yourself. Rich people across Europe paid fortunes for Murano glass. It sat on their tables, hung in their windows, decorated their churches, and every piece that sold sent money flowing back to Venice, back to the families who controlled the furnaces, back into the economy that kept the whole machine running. The glass was just the beginning. Venice produced silk that rivaled anything from China. Workshops employed hundreds of women who spent their days at looms, turning raw thread into fabric that shimmered like water in sunlight. The work ruined your eyes eventually. By 40, most weavers could barely see. But the silk they made dressed royalty from London to Moscow. Cotton came through Venice too, processed and dyed and sent back out at massive markups. Wood carving reached levels of artistry that people still study today. Furniture for palaces, decorative panels for churches, intricate boxes meant to hold jewellery, themselves more valuable than most jewellery, and the lace. Women on the island of Burano made lace so fine it looked like frozen spiderwebs. They worked in doorways to catch the light, their needles moving in patterns passed down through generations. A single piece might take months. The result was worth more than its weight in gold. All of this production required workers, thousands of them. Venice in the 1500s held maybe 150,000 people, packed onto islands that added up to less than 3 square miles. You could hear your neighbours through the walls. You could smell what they were cooking. Privacy was a luxury for the very rich. Then there was printing, 1469. The Doge Cristoforo Moro signed a document giving a German immigrant named Johannes of Speyer the exclusive right to print books in Venice. It was the city's first printing license. Within months, books were rolling off the press. 30 years later, Venice was producing more books than Florence, Milan, Rome and Naples combined. More books than anywhere else in Europe. The city had become the printing capital of the world. How? Same reason as everything else. Money, infrastructure and a willingness to take risks. Printing required capital. Presses were expensive. Paper was expensive. The skilled workers who could actually operate the equipment were really expensive. Venice had investors willing to fund these ventures because Venice understood trade. A book was just another commodity. Buy low, sell high, ship it where the demand is. The city also had something else, Aldus Manutius. Aldus was an obsessive, a scholar who'd spent his youth studying Greek, translating classical texts, dreaming of making ancient wisdom available to everyone. When he discovered printing, he saw his chance. He set up shop in Venice around 1490, started publishing Greek classics that hadn't been widely available since the fall of Constantinople. Aristotle, Plato, the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, texts that scholars had to travel to monastery libraries to read, now available for purchase, shipped anywhere in Europe. But his real genius was the format. Books in those days were huge, heavy, expensive, meant to sit on lecterns in libraries, not to be carried around. Aldus invented something new, the octavo, smaller pages, cheaper paper, a book you could actually hold in one hand, a book you could slip into a saddlebag or a travelling case, a book that cost a fraction of the old folio editions, the paperback. Aldus Manutius invented the paperback 500 years before anyone called it that. His editions sold everywhere. Students in Paris and Oxford and Padua bought them. Merchants picked them up for long voyages. Priests carried them into the countryside. Suddenly, reading wasn't just for the rich anymore. If you could scrape together a few coins, you could own Virgil. You could own Cicero. You could own the collected works of Aristotle in a set small enough to fit on a single shelf. The printing industry transformed Venice. Paper mills sprung up on the mainland. Ink makers and typesetters and bookbinders filled entire neighbourhoods. The city that had made its fortune shipping spices now shipped ideas, and the ideas mattered. This was the Renaissance, the rebirth. Scholars across Europe were rediscovering ancient texts, asking new questions, challenging old authorities. The humanists, they called themselves. People like Francesco Barbaro, a Venetian nobleman who studied Greek and Latin and corresponded with scholars across the continent. The greatest minds in Europe passed through Venice. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the most famous intellectual of his age, came to work with Aldous on Greek editions. He complained about the food and the weather, but stayed for months anyway. Galileo Galilei, decades later, demonstrated his new telescope for the Doge, pointed it at the moon, at Jupiter, at ships approaching from so far away they were invisible to the naked eye. The Doge understood immediately. Military applications. Spot your enemies before they spot you. Venice bought the telescope design on the spot. That was Venice in a nutshell. Art and commerce. Ideas and profit. The same city that produced Titian and Tintoretto also produced the most sophisticated diplomatic corps in Europe. Ambassadors in every capital, sending coded messages back to the Senate. Spies in every court. Information networks that would make a modern intelligence agency jealous. The government wanted to know everything. Trade conditions in Alexandria. Political intrigues in Paris. Who was sleeping with whom in the Ottoman court? All of it mattered, because all of it affected commerce, and commerce was the blood that kept Venice alive. Walk through the city at its peak. Cross the Rialto Bridge, still wooden but elaborately decorated, shops built right onto the span, merchants hawking everything from silk to sausages. Follow the Grand Canal past palaces that took generations to build, each family trying to outdo its neighbours. The Cadoro with its gilded facade, the Palazzo Ducale where the Doge held court, churches on every corner, their walls disappearing under layers of painting and gilding and marble veneer. The sounds hit you in waves, church bells marking the hours, a different tone from each campanile, boatmen calling out as they approached blind corners, a whole vocabulary of shouts and whistles, street vendors singing about their wares, fish fresh from the lagoon, bread still warm from the oven. The smells were harder to romanticize. Salt and seaweed, always. Fish guts rotting where the market waste got dumped. Human waste too, because the canals served as sewers and nobody pretended otherwise. Perfume from the rich, trying to cover the universal stink. You got used to it. Everyone got used to it. And everywhere, people. Nobles in their black robes, the uniform of the ruling class, merchants in expensive furs, servants and slaves and sailors from every corner of the Mediterranean, courtesans so famous they published poetry, beggars working the crowds outside the churches, priests, soldiers, glass blowers with burned hands, printers with ink-stained fingers. The Bridge of Sighs connected the Doge's palace to the prison next door. Prisoners crossed it on their way to their cells, catching a last glimpse of the lagoon through the bridge's small windows. That's where the name came from. The sigh of men seeing beauty for the last time before descending into darkness. Venice wasn't kind. Venice was never kind. But it was beautiful. Impossibly, outrageously, heart-stoppingly beautiful. A city that shouldn't exist, built on wooden posts driven into mud, rising from the water like a dream made solid. Visitors wrote about it constantly. Philippe de Comines, a French diplomat, called it the most triumphant city he'd ever seen. Petrarch, the great poet, praised it as rich in gold but richer in fame, strong in power but stronger in virtue. Virtue might have been a stretch, but the rest was true enough. Venice in the 1500s was the richest, most beautiful, most powerful city in Italy, maybe in all of Europe. 1,000 years of trade and war and diplomacy had built something unprecedented. A republic of merchants that outlasted kingdoms, an empire of islands that controlled the seas, and the architects, can't forget the architects. Andrea Palladio showed up in Venice and basically invented a whole new way of building. Clean lines, classical proportions, the kind of buildings that looked like they'd been there since ancient Rome, even though the paint was still wet. His churches still stand along the Grand Canal. His style spread across Europe and eventually to America. Every white-columned government building you've ever seen. That's Palladio's fault. You're welcome. But here's the thing about golden ages. They don't last. And Venice's had a habit of getting interrupted by mass death. The Black Death hit in 1348, killed maybe a third of the city's population. Bodies piled up faster than anyone could bury them. Venice recovered. Venice always recovered. But then plague came back. 1575. Another third of the population gone. 1529. Same story. Every few generations, death swept through like a broom. The government tried everything. They created a public health board, one of the first in Europe. They built hospitals specifically for plague victims, out on islands in the Lagoon. They burned the clothes and bedding of the dead. And they invented quarantine. Seriously, the word comes from Venice. Quarantina. 40 days. That's how long ships had to wait at anchor before anyone could come ashore. 40 days of isolation, watching the city from the water, waiting to see if anyone on board got sick. It worked. Sort of. The plagues kept coming, but they didn't spread as fast as they might have. Venice figured out disease control 300 years before anyone understood germs. The plague of 1576 killed Titian, the greatest painter in Venice, dead of the same disease that took beggars and dock workers. He was somewhere in his late 80s, which was miraculous for the time. Here's the weird part. Venice had strict rules about plague deaths. No public funerals, no gatherings, bodies buried quickly, quietly, without ceremony. But for Titian, they made an exception. A funeral mass in the Frari church, mourners in the pews, the whole thing. It tells you something about how Venice valued its artists. Some things mattered more than safety, but empires attract enemies, and Venice had made plenty of those. The Ottomans were watching from across the water. They'd taken Constantinople 50 years earlier. They were expanding west year by year, island by island, and they had Venice's empire firmly in their sights. The Golden Age was about to run into the Iron Age, and Venice would discover that all the art and books and beautiful glass in the world couldn't stop a cannonball. The news reached Venice in the summer of 1453. Constantinople had fallen. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years the greatest Christian capital in the East, the place Venetian merchants had called their second home for generations, gone, taken by the Ottoman Turks after a siege of less than 2 months. Sultan Mehmed, just 21 years old, rode his horse into the Hagia Sophia, the church where Dandolo was buried, where the Fourth Crusade had celebrated its terrible victory 2.5 centuries earlier. Now it would become a mosque. The Byzantine Empire, already a shadow of its former self, finally stopped breathing. Venice sent diplomats immediately, not to fight, to negotiate. That's the thing about the Venetians. They were practical above everything else. Constantinople had fallen. Fine. The Ottomans controlled the eastern trade routes now? Fine. Let's make a deal. Let's figure out how we can keep doing business. You have to admire the audacity. The greatest Christian city in the East just fell to Muslim conquerors. Christians were being enslaved. Churches were being converted to mosques. And Venice's first response was basically, "So, are you guys still buying pepper? Because we have pepper." And for a while, it worked. The Sultan let Venetian merchants stay, same trading rights they'd always had. The spice ships kept sailing. The gold kept flowing. Everyone pretended nothing had changed, but everyone knew better. Mehmed wasn't finished. He called himself the Conqueror, and he meant to earn the title. His armies pushed west into the Balkans, swallowing kingdoms that had stood for centuries. His fleets probed the Aegean, testing Venetian defences, looking for weaknesses. Every year brought new fortresses, new shipyards, new soldiers trained in the Ottoman way of war. The Sultan had Constantinople. He had the overland trade routes. He had armies that dwarfed anything the Christian powers could muster. And he had Venice's empire firmly in his sights. Venetian merchants in the east started sending worried letters home. The Turks were building galleys at an alarming rate. Their foundries were casting cannons bigger than anything Venice had. The officials who'd always been bribbable were getting harder to buy. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. The first real blow came at Negroponte. Euboea, the Greeks called it. A long island off the eastern coast of Greece, Venetian territory for 2.5 centuries. In 1470, a massive Ottoman force attacked. The garrison held out for a month. 1 month against everything the Sultan could throw at them. When the walls finally broke, the Ottomans showed no mercy. The Venetian governor was sawn in half. The population was massacred or enslaved. The message was clear. Venice wasn't untouchable anymore. The wars dragged on for decades. Venice won some battles, lost others. Their fleet, once supreme in these waters, found itself matched by Ottoman galleys built in shipyards that rivaled the Arsenale. Ottoman admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa, a former pirate who'd risen to command the Sultan's navy, outmaneuvered Venetian captains who'd grown up thinking the sea belonged to them. By 1500, the twin eyes of the Republic were gone. Modone and Corone, the ports that watched over the sea lanes between Venice and the east, captured by Ottoman forces. The Venetian Empire was shrinking, island by island, harbour by harbour. The Republic tried everything, alliances with other Christian powers that fell apart as soon as the immediate threat passed. Massive investments in fortifications that bought time but couldn't stop the bleeding. Bribes to Ottoman officials that worked until they didn't. Nothing stopped the slow collapse. Then, in 1570, the Ottomans came for Cyprus. Cyprus mattered. It was big, rich, strategically located. Venice had controlled it since 1489, and losing it would be a catastrophe. When Ottoman ships appeared off the coast that summer, the Republic knew this was the fight of their lives. They sent what help they could. But Cyprus was far away, and the Ottoman fleet controlled the waters in between. Reinforcements trickled in while 100,000 Turkish soldiers poured onto the island. The capital, Nicosia, fell in September. 7 weeks of siege, then the walls came down and the killing started. 20,000 people died in the sack. The Ottoman commander sent the Venetian governor's head to the other garrisons as a warning. Only Famagusta held out. The city's commander was Marcantonio Bragadin, a nobleman, a soldier, a man who understood exactly how bad the odds were. He had maybe 7,000 defenders against an army 10 times that size. No hope of relief, no realistic chance of victory. He fought anyway. For 11 months Famagusta resisted. 11 months of bombardment and assault and disease and starvation. The Ottomans dug trenches toward the walls, zigzagging closer each night, while Venetian gunners tried to pick them off by torchlight. They launched assault after assault, waves of soldiers climbing ladders and pouring through breaches, only to be thrown back by defenders who had nowhere to retreat. The Ottomans lost 50,000 men trying to take that city. 50,000. Their casualties were so horrific that some Ottoman generals wanted to give up and sail home. The trenches filled with bodies, the beaches turned red. Turkish mothers would curse the name Famagusta for generations. Inside the walls, things were just as bad. The garrison shrank from 7,000 to a few hundred. Powder ran low, then ran out. They melted down church bells for cannonballs. They ate the horses first, then the cats and dogs, then the rats, then boiled leather because there was nothing else. Disease crept through the narrow streets. Men died of fever as often as Turkish bullets. The hospitals overflowed. There was no medicine, barely any water. Surgeons amputated limbs without anaesthetic, holding men down while they screamed. Bragadin walked the walls every day, checking the defences, encouraging his men, showing them that their commander hadn't given up, wouldn't give up, would stand with them until the end. He'd lost weight like everyone else. His uniform hung loose on his frame, but his voice never wavered. By August 1571 there was nothing left. The walls were rubble. The defenders were ghosts. Bragadin had maybe 1,000 men still able to fight, and half of them could barely stand. Bragadin negotiated a surrender, honourable terms. His soldiers would be allowed to leave with their weapons and their flags. They'd be given safe passage to Venetian territory, the usual deal for a garrison that had fought bravely. The Ottoman commander, Lala Mustafa Pasha, agreed. He signed the documents, he shook hands, and then he broke every promise he'd made. When Bragadin came to formalise the surrender, the Ottomans seized him. They accused him of murdering Turkish prisoners during the siege. Maybe true, maybe not. Didn't matter. This wasn't about justice. They cut off his ears. They cut off his nose. They made him carry baskets of earth to the walls he defended, staggering under the weight while soldiers beat him. They chained him to a post in the public square and left him there for days, and then they flayed him alive. They started at his feet and worked upward, a skilled executioner doing careful work. Bragadin reportedly recited psalms until he lost consciousness. He died somewhere around his waist, which was probably a mercy. His skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in his own clothes, and paraded through the streets. Then it was hung from the yardarm of Lala Mustafa's flagship and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. The news hit Venice like a bomb. Everyone knew someone who'd served with Bragadin. Everyone had heard stories of the defence, how he'd held out for months against impossible odds, how his garrison had made the Ottomans bleed for every inch of that city. And now this. Torture, mutilation, desecration. Venice wanted revenge, not profit, not negotiation. Blood. This was new. Venice had spent centuries being the people who said, let's not get emotional about this. Let's think about the bottom line. Venice was the city that turned the Fourth Crusade into a real estate deal. Venice was the place where everything had a price and nothing was personal. But this was personal. Bragadin had been one of them. A nobleman, a patriot, a man who'd fought and died for the Republic, and the Ottomans had skinned him like an animal. For once, the rest of Christian Europe agreed. Pope Pius V had been trying for years to organise a crusade against the Ottomans. Nobody wanted to listen. Spain was busy with its empire in the Americas. France was dealing with religious wars at home. The German princes couldn't agree on anything. But Bragadin's martyrdom changed something. Suddenly, people cared. The Holy League came together in the summer of 1571. Venice, Spain, the Papal States, Genoa, Savoy, and a handful of smaller powers, 200 galleys, 50,000 soldiers, the largest Christian fleet assembled since the days of the Crusades. They found the Ottoman fleet at Lepanto in the Gulf of Corinth on October 7th. The Ottomans had around 230 galleys, experienced crews, battle-hardened admirals. They'd beaten Christian fleets before and expected to do it again. What happened next was the largest galley battle in history. 200 years of naval warfare came down to a single morning. 400 ships crammed into waters barely wide enough to maneuver. 60,000 men on each side, the fate of the Mediterranean in the balance. The night before, both fleets prepared for what everyone knew would be decisive. Priests heard confessions, soldiers sharpened swords, gunners counted their powder charges and prayed they'd be enough. Nobody slept much. The cooking fires of the enemy fleet glittered across the dark water like fallen stars. The Christian fleet attacked at dawn. Their commander, Don John of Austria, flew a blue banner from his flagship. He was 24 years old, illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor, with everything to prove and nothing to lose. The Venetians held the left wing, right where the fighting would be heaviest. They'd insisted on it. This was their war, their revenge. The morning mist lifted around 9. Both fleets could finally see each other clearly. The Ottoman line stretched for miles, crescent-shaped, the horns reaching forward to envelop the Christian force. Drums beat on both sides, trumpets screamed, men said their last prayers. The fleets crashed together around 10 in the morning. Galleys locked oars and became floating battlefields. The ram of one ship ploughed into the hull of another. Grappling hooks flew through the air. Boarding planks slammed down. Soldiers swarmed across decks, fighting hand to hand in spaces barely wide enough to swing a sword. The noise was beyond description. Steel on steel. Men screaming in 3 languages. Cannons firing at point-blank range into packed masses of bodies. The crack of arquebus fire. The whoosh of fire arrows trailing smoke. Crossbow bolts and arquebus balls ripped through packed bodies. Men fell into the water and drowned under the weight of their armour. The sea turned red. Bodies floated between the locked ships, bumping against oars, getting tangled in rigging. The Venetians fought like men possessed. They had Bragadin's skin in their minds, his screams in their ears. Every Ottoman they killed was a payment on a debt. Every ship they captured was justice long delayed. The battle lasted 5 hours. By afternoon, the Ottoman fleet was destroyed. 170 galleys captured or sunk. 30,000 Ottomans dead. The Christian slaves who'd rowed the Turkish ships were freed. 15,000 men breaking their chains and joining the fight against their former masters. The Christian losses were heavy too. 13 galleys sunk, 7,000 dead. But it was a victory, an overwhelming, undeniable victory. Word spread across Europe. Church bells rang from Lisbon to Vienna. Bonfires lit up the night in cities that had spent decades fearing an Ottoman invasion. For one moment, Christendom was united in celebration. Sebastiano Venier, the Venetian admiral, was 75 years old. He'd fought on the front lines with his men, arquebus in hand, leading boarding actions despite his age. When it was over, when the last Ottoman resistance collapsed, he reportedly wept. Venice had its revenge. Bragadin was avenged. The Ottomans had been smashed, and it didn't matter. Here's the thing about Lepanto. It was a great victory. Poets wrote about it. Painters immortalized it. Historians call it one of the decisive battles of world history. But it didn't actually change much. The Ottoman Empire was huge. Losing a fleet hurt, but the Sultan had the resources to build another one. By the following spring, Ottoman shipyards had replaced most of their losses. The new fleet wasn't quite as good as the old one. The experienced sailors were harder to replace than the ships, but it was good enough. Cyprus stayed Ottoman. It would remain Ottoman for the next 300 years. All those Venetian soldiers who died defending Famagusta, all Bragadin's suffering, all the blood spilled at Lepanto, none of it got Cyprus back. The Holy League fell apart almost immediately. Spain and Venice started arguing about strategy. The Pope died. The new Pope had different priorities. By 1573, Venice had signed a separate peace with the Ottomans, accepting the loss of Cyprus in exchange for the right to keep trading. Business as usual, Venice being Venice. But something had shifted. The republic that once dominated the eastern Mediterranean was now just another player, scrambling to hold on to what it had left. The trade routes that had made Venice rich were being bypassed by Portuguese ships sailing around Africa. The Ottoman threat would never fully go away. Venice was still beautiful, still powerful, still the envy of every other Italian state. But the golden age was fading. The empire that Dandolo had built, that Marco Polo had grown up in, that Titian had painted, was slowly bleeding out. Not dying, not yet. Venice had survived too much to die easily, but weakening, year by year, decade by decade. The future belonged to other powers now, the Atlantic states with their new trade routes, the Ottoman Empire with its vast armies, the rising kingdoms of France and Spain and England. Venice would have more battles to fight, more sieges to endure, one more miracle to pull off before the end. The Serenissima still had cards to play. Her diplomats were still the best in Europe. Her shipyards could still turn out galleys when needed. Her merchants still knew every harbour and market from Gibraltar to the Black Sea. Old habits die hard, and Venice had been doing this for 1,000 years. But the confidence was gone. That unshakable belief that Venice would always find a way, always come out ahead, always turn crisis into opportunity. Lepanto should have been the beginning of a reconquest. Instead, it was the high water mark. Everything after would be defence, holding on, trying to keep what was left. The city herself remained magnificent. The palaces kept rising along the Grand Canal. The painters kept painting. The printers kept printing. Visitors kept coming from across Europe, marvelling at the beauty, at the improbable city floating on the water. From the outside, nothing had changed. But the Venetians knew. In the councils and the counting houses, in the quiet conversations after the official business was done, they knew the world was shifting. They knew their moment was passing. And somewhere in Constantinople, in a church that used to be Christian, Bragadin's skin still hung, a trophy, a warning, a reminder that even the mighty fall. The cat's name was Nini, a small thing, grey and white, with the kind of face that made people stop and scratch behind its ears. Francesco Morosini took that cat everywhere. Council meetings, ship inspections, into battle. Yes, into battle. A Venetian admiral sailing toward Turkish cannons with a cat sitting on his shoulder. I cannot stress this enough. A cat on a warship during actual naval combat while cannons are firing. The cat just sat there, apparently unbothered by the explosions and the screaming and the general chaos of men trying to kill each other. Cats, man. They really don't care about anything. People thought Morosini was eccentric, maybe a little crazy. But nobody said it to his face, because Francesco Morosini was the only reason Venice still had anything left in the East. He'd spent decades fighting the Ottomans while other men sat in their palaces and talked about how terrible things were. He'd bled for the Republic. He'd watched friends die. He'd held fortresses that everyone said couldn't be held. And through all of it, Nini was there. Some said Morosini believed the cat brought him luck. Others said he just liked the company. Soldiers whispered that the cat had survived more battles than most veterans. Either way, the cat went where the Admiral went, and the Admiral went wherever the fighting was worst. In 1645, the worst fighting was Crete. Crete was Venice's last major possession in the eastern Mediterranean. The big one. Everything else had been nibbled away over the centuries, but Crete remained. 250,000 people, rich farmland, strategic harbours, the kind of territory worth fighting for. The Ottomans wanted it. They'd wanted it for a long time. In 1645, they finally came to take it. The excuse was piracy. Some Maltese knights, Christian corsairs operating out of the central Mediterranean, had captured an Ottoman ship carrying pilgrims to Mecca. They'd taken the ship to Crete to sell the cargo. The Sultan was furious. He demanded the pirates be handed over. Venice refused. Maybe they couldn't find the pirates. Maybe they didn't try very hard. Either way, the Sultan had his justification. 50,000 Ottoman troops landed on Crete that summer. They swept across the island, taking town after town, fortress after fortress. Within 2 years, almost everything had fallen. Everything except Candia. Candia was the capital, the main city, the place where the Venetian governor lived and the biggest garrison was stationed. Its walls were some of the strongest in the Mediterranean, designed by the best military engineers money could buy. Taking it would be expensive. The Ottomans settled in for a siege. They figured it would take a few months, maybe a year. It took 21 years. 21 years. Think about that. A child born when the siege started would be old enough to have children of their own before it ended. Entire generations knew nothing but war. Soldiers who arrived as young men left as old ones, if they left at all. The Ottomans tried everything. Bombardment, mining, assault after assault against walls that just wouldn't break. They lost men by the thousands, then tens of thousands. Disease swept through their camps. Supplies ran short. Commanders were replaced, then replaced again. The Sultan sent angry letters demanding to know why this one city was taking so long. Inside the walls, things weren't much better. The garrison shrank as men died, and reinforcements failed to arrive. Food grew scarce. Fresh water had to be rationed. The constant bombardment wore on everyone's nerves, the random terror of shells falling from the sky, never knowing if this moment would be your last. The defenders lived underground as much as possible. Tunnels connecting the bastions, bunkers carved into the earth behind the walls. You learned to sleep through explosions, or you didn't sleep at all. You learned to move fast when you had to cross open ground, darting between cover, praying the Ottoman gunners were looking somewhere else. The children who grew up during the siege didn't know any other life. They played games among the rubble. They collected spent musket balls and artillery fragments like other kids collected shells on a beach. Some of them became soldiers themselves before the siege ended, old enough to fight for a city they'd never seen at peace. Death was everywhere. Bodies got buried quickly when there was time, left where they fell when there wasn't. The smell of decay mixed with gunpowder and smoke until you couldn't distinguish them anymore. Priests moved through the streets giving last rites, so many that the words became mechanical, a production line of salvation. But they held. Somehow, impossibly, they held. Venice sent what help it could. Ships slipped through the Ottoman blockade carrying powder and provisions, volunteers. arrived from across Europe, young men looking for glory or redemption or just a good fight. Knights of Malta, French nobles, German mercenaries, even the Pope sent soldiers. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it kept Candia alive year after year, while the Ottomans bled themselves dry against those walls. Francesco Morosini arrived in 1667 near the end. He was appointed Captain General of the Venetian forces, the highest military command the Republic could offer. His job was simple: hold Candia, or, if that proved impossible, make the Ottomans pay so dearly that they'd think twice before attacking Venice again. Morosini threw himself into the defence. He reorganised the garrison. He improved the fortifications. He led sorties against the Ottoman lines, striking at night when surprise could multiply his small forces. His cat rode on his shoulder through it all, impassive, watching the carnage with yellow eyes. The Ottomans launched a massive assault in 1668. Thousands of men poured toward the walls in what was supposed to be the final attack. The fighting lasted days, hand to hand in the breaches, bodies piling up faster than anyone could clear them. The noise never stopped, not even at night. Candia held, barely. The walls were rubble in places. The garrison was exhausted, but the flag still flew. Then the French went home. Louis XIV had sent 6,000 soldiers to help defend Candia. Good troops, well equipped, commanded by experienced officers. For a few months they made a real difference. Then Louis changed his mind. He needed those soldiers elsewhere. Politics back in France. Always politics. The French sailed away in August 1669. Morosini watched them go from the walls, knowing what it meant. Without reinforcements, without hope of relief, Candia couldn't last much longer. He held out another month. One more month of bombardment and assault and men dying for a cause that was already lost. Then, finally, he negotiated surrender. The terms were decent considering. The garrison could leave with their weapons and their honour. Civilians who wanted to go could go. No massacre, no atrocities. Just the end of Venetian rule over an island they'd held for 465 years. Morosini sailed away from Candia on September 27th, 1669. His cat was with him. Behind him, the Ottomans moved into the ruins of a city that had cost them over 100,000 men. Venice had lost Crete, but Venice had made the Ottomans bleed, and Morosini would have his chance for revenge. 14 years later, the Ottomans made a terrible mistake. In 1683, a massive Ottoman army marched on Vienna. 200,000 men, they said, though the numbers were probably exaggerated. Either way, it was huge. The largest Ottoman force to threaten Central Europe in living memory. They thought Vienna would fall quickly. They were wrong. A relief. Army arrived just in time. Polish hussars charged down the hills and shattered the Ottoman siege lines. The Sultan's forces broke and ran, leaving their camp, their cannons, their treasury behind. The siege of Vienna became the greatest Ottoman defeat in centuries. Wide shot from elevated position, early medieval era 726 AD, torchlit wooden assembly hall filled with Lagoon elders in rough wool tunics, men raising hands to vote for first Doge, elderly man also receiving simple circlet crown, flickering firelight casting dancing shadows on timber walls, warm amber tones with dramatic atmosphere, History Channel documentary style, filmed with low-light documentary technique with authentic film grain,